from an election when Americans may pick a new president, and that president should be able to fill this Supreme Court seat. They've also pointed to the fact that there are pending lawsuits, one in particular set for just a few days after the election, where the status of the Affordable Care Act is likely on the line. And they've been showing large photos. You can see some of them in the shots of the room. Behind all of them, their constituents, they say, of theirs who are facing health challenges, and they're using those stories to try to explain why they don't think Amy Coney Barrett should be put on the bench. Republicans, on the other hand, have been defending her. They have been trying to speak to her character. They've talked about her family. She is the mother of 7. Her children have been in the hearing room for large portions of this hearing, although they did step out for a few minutes. They've also been defending her religious views and accusing Democrats of attacking them, although we have not seen very much of that from Democrats throughout the course of today's hearing anyway. So the other thing that's been overshadowing this hearing, Lester, has been the pandemic. Obviously, the form that this hearing took, much different than other Supreme Court hearings we have seen in the past with social distancing. Lester.
Casey, thank you. Let's go back to the hearing room. Judge Barrett now being sworn in.
Thank you. Welcome to the committee, to your family. Y'all have done a great job over there. The floor is yours, Judge.
Chairman Brown. I'm not sure this is on. Ranking Member Feinstein and members of the committee, I'm honored and humbled to appear before you today as a nominee for Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. I thank the President for entrusting me with this profound responsibility, as well as for the graciousness that he and the First Lady have shown my family throughout this process. I thank Senator Young for introducing me, as he did at my hearing, to serve on the 7th Circuit. And I also thank Senator Braun for his support. And while she could not be with us via the satellite, I am also grateful to former Dean Patty O'Hara of the Notre Dame Law School. She hired me as a professor nearly 20 years ago, and she has been a mentor, colleague, and friend ever since. I thank the members of this committee and your other colleagues in the Senate who've taken the time to meet with me since my nomination. It's been a privilege to meet you. As I said when I was nominated to serve as a justice, I'm used to being in a group of 9, my family. Nothing is more important to me, and I'm very proud to have them behind me. My husband, Jesse, and I have been married for 21 years. He has been a selfless and wonderful partner every step of the way. I once asked my sister, "Why do you think marriage is hard? People are always saying that." "I think it's easy." And she looked at me and said, "Well, maybe you should ask Jesse if he agrees with that." I decided not to take her advice because I know that I am far luckier in love than I deserve. Jesse and I are parents to 7 wonderful children. Our oldest daughter, Emma, is a sophomore in college who just might follow her parents into a career in the law. Next is Vivian, who came to us from Haiti. When Vivian arrived, she was so weak that we were told she might never talk or walk normally. But now she deadlifts as much as the male athletes in our gym, and I assure you she has no trouble talking. Tess is 16, and while she shares her parents' love for the liberal arts, she also has a math gene that seems to have skipped her parents' generation. John Peter joined us shortly after the devastating earthquake in Haiti. And Jesse, who brought him home, still describes the shock on JP's face when he got off the plane in wintertime Chicago. Once that shock wore off, JP assumed the happy-go-lucky attitude that is still his signature trait. Liam is smart, strong, and kind, and to our delight, he still loves watching movies with Mom and Dad. 10-year-old Juliet is already pursuing her goal of becoming an author by writing multiple essays and short stories, one of which she recently submitted for publication. And our youngest, Benjamin, is at home with friends. Benjamin has Down syndrome, and he is the unanimous favorite of the family. He was watching the hearing this morning, I'm told, and he was calling out our names as he saw the kids in the back. My own siblings are here, some in the hearing room and some nearby. Carrie, Megan, Eileen, Amanda, Vivian, and Michael are my oldest and dearest friends. We've seen each other through both the happy and hard parts of life, and I am so grateful that they are with me now. My parents, Mike and Linda Coney, are watching from their New Orleans home. My father was a lawyer and my mother was a teacher, which explains why I became a law professor. More important, my parents modeled for me and my 6 siblings a life of service, principle, faith, and love. I remember preparing for a grade school spelling bee against a boy in my class, and to boost my confidence, my dad saying, "Anything boys can do, girls can do better." And at least as I remember it, I spelled my way to victory. I received similar encouragement from the devoted teachers at St. Mary's Dominican, my all-girls high school in New Orleans. When I went to college, it never occurred to me that anyone would consider girls less capable than boys. My freshman year, I took a literature class filled with upperclassmen English majors. And when I did my first presentation, which was on Breakfast at Tiffany's, I feared I had failed. But my professor took the time to talk to me. She filled me with confidence about how well I had done, and she became a mentor. And when I graduated with a degree in English, she gave me Truman Capote's collected works as a gift. Although I considered graduate studies in English, I decided that my passion for words was better suited to deciphering statutes than novels. I was fortunate to have wonderful legal mentors. In particular, the judges for whom I clerked. The legendary Judge Lawrence Silberman of the D.C. Circuit gave me my first job in the law, and he continues to teach me today. He was by my side during my Seventh Circuit hearing. He swore me in at my investiture, and he's cheering me on from his living room right now. I also clerked for Justice Scalia, and like many law students, I felt like I knew the justice before I ever met him, because I had read so many of his colorful, accessible opinions. More than the style of his writing, though, it was the content of Justice Scalia's reasoning that shaped me. His judicial philosophy was straightforward. A judge must apply the law as it is written, not as she wishes it were. Sometimes that approach meant reaching results that he did not like. But as he put it in one of his best-known opinions, that is what it means to say that we have a government of laws and not of men. Justice Scalia taught me more than just law. He was devoted to his family, resolute in his beliefs, and fearless of criticism. And as I embarked on my own legal career, I resolved to maintain that same perspective. There's a tendency in our profession to treat the practice of law as all-consuming while losing sight of everything else. But that makes for a shallow and unfulfilling life. I worked hard as a lawyer and as a professor. I owed that to my clients, to my students, and to myself. But I never let the law define my identity or crowd out the rest of my life. A similar principle applies to the role of courts. Courts have a vital responsibility to the rule of law, which is critical to a free society. But courts are not designed to solve every problem or right every wrong in our public life. The policy decisions and value judgments of government must be made by the political branches, elected by and accountable to the people. The public should not expect courts to do so, and courts should not try. That is the approach that I have strived to follow as a judge on the Seventh Circuit. In every case, I have carefully considered the arguments presented by the parties, discussed the issues with my colleagues on the court, and done my utmost to reach the result required by the law, whatever my own preferences might be. I try to remain mindful that while my court decides thousands of cases a year, each case is the most important one to the litigants involved. After all, cases are not like statutes, which are often named for their authors. Cases are named for the parties who stand to gain or lose in the real world, often through their liberty or livelihood. When I write an opinion resolving a case, I read every word from the perspective of the losing party. I ask myself how I would view the decision if one of my children was the party that I was ruling against. Even though I would not like the result, would I understand that the decision was fairly reasoned and grounded in law? That is the standard that I set for myself in every case, and it is the standard that I will follow so long as I am a judge on any court. When the President offered me this nomination, I was deeply honored. But it was not a position I had sought out and I thought carefully before accepting. The confirmation process and the work of serving on the court, if confirmed, requires sacrifices, particularly from my family. I chose to accept the nomination because I believe deeply in the rule of law and the place of the Supreme Court in our nation. I believe Americans of all backgrounds deserve an independent Supreme Court that interprets our Constitution and laws as they are written. And I believe I can serve my country by playing that role. I come before this committee with humility about the responsibility that I have been asked to undertake, and with appreciation for those who have come before me. I was 9 years old when Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman to sit in this seat. She was a model of grace and dignity throughout her distinguished tenure on the court. When I was 21 years old and just beginning my career, Ruth Bader Ginsburg sat in this seat. She told the committee, "What has become of me could only happen in America." I have been nominated to fill Justice Ginsburg's seat, but no one will ever take her place. I will be forever grateful for the path she marked and the life she led. If confirmed, it would be the honor of a lifetime to serve alongside the Chief Justice and 7 Associate Justices. I admire them all and would consider each a valued colleague. And I might bring a few new perspectives to the bench. As the President noted when he announced my nomination, I would be the first mother of school-aged children to serve on the court. And I know that it would make Senators Young and Braun happy to know that I would be the first justice to join the court from the 7th Circuit in 45 years. I would be the only sitting justice who didn't attend school at Harvard or Yale, but I am confident that Notre Dame could hold its own, and maybe I could even teach them a thing or two about football. As a final note, Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank the many Americans from all walks of life who have reached out with messages of support over the course of my nomination. I believe in the power of prayer, and it has been uplifting to hear that so many people are praying for me. I look forward to answering the committee's questions over the coming days. And if I am fortunate enough to be confirmed, I pledge to faithfully and impartially discharge my duties to the American people as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Barrett. Let's try Professor O'Hara. Any luck with her?
I'm here, Chairman Graham.
Thank you. I apologize for the problem.
We should let you know what's happening there is there were 3 individuals who were to introduce Judge Barrett, including the former law professor, former dean at Notre Dame, but they had apparently some issues, technical issues, and she was not able to speak. But nonetheless, you've heard the opening remarks from Judge Amy Coney Barrett at the beginning of these confirmation hearings. The real questioning will take place tomorrow in what's expected to be a marathon session here before the Judiciary Committee. I want to go to Justice Correspondent Pete Williams right now, who covers the Supreme Court. There was a lot said today about the speed of this process, 16 days from the point of nomination. We heard Lindsey Graham at one point, Pete, talk about the fact, well, we could have pushed this through, but we decided to hold hearings. Tell us what's normal and what's abnormal here about this process.
I think what's abnormal about it is to do it this fast at a time when the Senate has become so contentious. Yes, it's true, as many Republicans pointed out, that there were times in the past where the time from nomination to confirmation was very short. But in modern times, it's been much longer. So this is certainly compressed. But Lester, you know, the people supporting her nomination make no bones about it. The Republicans are rushing to do this while they still control the Senate and while their president is still in the White House. So that's really what this is all about. But it certainly is a compressed time frame, no question about that.
All right, let me go to our senior Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. She's been covering the Supreme Court nominations for more than 30 years. Andrea, we heard both sides, as we noted earlier, really sticking to their kind of prepared talking points here. Democrats obviously wanted to focus on the vulnerability of the Affordable Care Act, all this happening in the middle of a presidential election. How fine a line do Democrats walk here?
It's a bit of a misnomer.
Well, it's very difficult for them because they don't have the votes, and she is obviously, according to her biography, a very appealing nominee, the mother of 7, obviously a young woman who has good academic credentials. But that said, this is the first time ever in memory that a nomination has been pushed through after July of an election year. That is unusual. And also, as Pete points out, at a time of such poisonous divisions in our society, they stuck very closely, the Democrats did, to their strategy of pointing out that the Affordable Care Act, as you say, will come up before the court on November 10th, just a week after the election, and that hangs in the balance if she is put on the court, because she has spoken out very frequently against that and against Justice Roberts, siding in favor of it in a 5-4 decision which upheld Obamacare. So that is notable, as well as sticking together. We don't often see Democrats sticking together so completely, with all of them focusing on health care. In the backdrop is, of course, the pandemic. Their concerns about 2 members of the committee, including one, Mike Lee, who showed up at times without a mask today, who were only diagnosed positive last week, and Tom Tillis, who was virtual in his presentation. Kamala Harris, of course, the nominee for vice president, doing it as a member of the committee from her office on the Capitol, but not coming in because of her concerns she expressed for lack of testing and lack of universal mask wearing by key members of the committee, and the risks to the staffs, to the Capitol policemen, to all of the sanitation people on the Hill, to all of those who could be vulnerable in cleaning up that hearing room, Lester.
All right, Andrea Mitchell, thank you. President Trump likely paying close attention to these hearings before heading to a campaign stop in Florida later today. Peter Alexander at the White House. What do you know about that, Peter?
Yeah, Lester, we know the president was watching, as evidenced by some of his tweets today, insulting one of the Democratic senators, speaking, saying that the Democrats were being given, in effect, too much time that he says was not mandated in a process like this. But takeaway, I think, from here is that for the president, this really is a reprieve from what has been foremost in the headlines for the course of the last several weeks, frankly months, the topic of coronavirus, including the president's own diagnosis here. And to give you a sense of just how important this nomination, this confirmation process is to the president, to this White House, the fact that his own legal counsel, the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, and his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, are physically sitting behind Amy Coney Barrett in the room there today. You talk about the president's travel. The president will return to the campaign trail later today and again over the next 3 days, 4 straight days in 4 separate states, where critics say he'll again be ignoring those CDC guidelines. The president saying that he has tested negative. His doctor has not yet said that he has tested negative. The president saying that he is now immune, that he can't spread the virus, even though at this point it's not entirely clear how long any immunity would last and how good that type of a protection is for someone who had the virus in the past. But the president recognizes that trying to focus on this court seat is better for him politically, perhaps, than anything else right now. A chance to try to say to those conservatives in the country, some who may not be satisfied with the president's behavior in office, that look what I have done in terms of the courts and in terms of some of my policies, and he hopes that will bring them back around to him and to his party.
All right, Peter, thank you. Let's stay at the White House now and bring in Yamiche Alcindor, correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and an NBC News political contributor. Yamiche, it became fairly clear from Democrats in their opening statements that they want to make this partially a referendum on the future of the Affordable Care Act. The president continues to suggest that he's got something to replace the ACA should the Supreme Court strike it down. Is it clear that he actually has that? Is there, as voters begin to pay close attention, is there a Republican option?
And they're interpreting.
As of right now, there has not been a Republican option presented by President Trump or by any Republican in the Senate or in the House. The president has continued to say now for years that the Republicans do have a plan to replace Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, but it has not materialized. What we have seen is the president say that he's going to continue to cover pre-existing conditions, that he's going to make sure that people's premiums are lower, but there isn't actually any sort of plan in place. So what you have is, instead is the president saying, trust me, I will give you something as soon as I take away your health care. I think it was really telling that Republicans have been really focusing on defending the merits of Judge Barrett, defending all of her credentials, her faith, but they haven't wanted to talk about policy. Instead, it's been the Democrats who've been talking about that. And of course, the president has said a bunch of things about policy and how conservative goals would be embodied by his nominations to the Supreme Court, but Republicans just haven't gone there, likely because they know that people would point out the fact that they have not put forth a plan.
All right, Yamiche, thank you. Let me quickly bring in Barbara McQuaid, a professor of law at the University of Michigan, a former assistant U.S. attorney, and an NBC News legal analyst. Barbara, let me ask you this. We keep hearing that Judge Barrett has left kind of a roadmap to her thoughts on Affordable Care Act, on Roe v. Wade. Are a person's writings or previous statements, I mean, looking at previous justices, do they often have detours and that roadmap not as solid as it may appear?
Well, sure, Lester. I mean, when a person is acting as a scholar, they may have different viewpoints than they have as a judge or a justice. And certainly the first time around, when Amy Coney Barrett was being considered to be on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, she repeatedly said in defense of things that she had written, as a judge on an appellate court, an intermediate court, I don't have even the ability to overturn Supreme Court precedent. It would be my duty to follow it. But the stakes are much higher when somebody is up for the Supreme Court. There she does have the ability to overturn precedent. And so I think looking at all of those things as a roadmap to how she might decide cases in the future becomes very relevant because of the unique and incredible power that Supreme Court justices enjoy.
All right, Barbara, thank you. And we look into that hearing room. It appears the hearing is over for today. Judge Barrett having delivered her opening statement, sworn in. The questioning begins tomorrow. That is going to conclude this portion of our coverage of the Senate confirmation hearing for Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett. For continuing coverage, you can go to NBC News Now. I'll be back with a complete wrap-up on nightly news, and tomorrow morning we'll bring you live coverage as senators begin to question Judge Barrett. For now, I'm Lester Holt.